Hello everyone! Welcome to the tutorial for my first Draw This in Your Style challenge. Please check it out on my Instagram and participate. The deadline is June 15th. The animation is meant to be beginner friendly for illustrators who want to try animation, or even for complete beginners as well. Although I'm not going to cover software and how to use it, so that anyone with any software that has animation tools can follow this. Most popular drawing softwares have a timeline or an option to make animation. Photoshop, Clip Studio Paint X version, which is the one I'm using. Procreate has a limited option, but it can work. Free alternatives are Krita and Blender Grease Pencil. Other iPad apps are Rough Animator, and I recently heard, but I haven't used, Calipeg and ToonSquid. If you're completely new, you might want to watch a quick tutorial to know how your software of choice works. Let's begin. Okay, so I have here the finished animation that I already shared on social media, and I'm going to start a new one and repeat the steps so that you can follow with me. Okay, so new. For the file size, you can make a square canvas 1080 by 1080. Or portrait for mobile and social media, it could be 1080 by 1920, or a 5:4 proportion that is 1080 by 1350. For screens, 72 dpi for resolution is fine, and the standard frame rate in animation is 24. Make sure this is the same to follow this tutorial, and in general, you'll almost always use 24 frames per second. You can change the playback time later or while working on your animation, but just know that it's going to be 2 seconds long. And some software have available blank space. You can use it or you can ignore it, and let's go. Okay, so here's my timeline, and all animation software use a timeline. If I ever go here on the layers, you can ignore this. This is for Clip Studio Paint, but other softwares work with their timeline. I'm going to roughly make a frame to know where my animation is going to take place. If you have a square canvas or a 5x4 canvas, you can ignore this. So now we're going to begin with the rough animation for the little guy, the yellow guy. And I'm going to start with the first keyframe, just around egg-like shape. And this keyframe is on the beginning. This is the first keyframe on frame 1, and I'm going to go all the way to frame 25 or the next second. You can turn on onion skin to facilitate the drawing, and then I'm going to make the second key. And I'm going to add the floor to know where the character is going to stand. And so I have keyframe 1 and keyframe 2. Keyframes are the drawings that tell the story or the extremes of the animation. So any drawing that is necessary to tell the story or any drawing that could be considered an extreme is a keyframe. In this case, we have both extremes, left and right. Now I'm going to add details. So I'm going to add the legs, the hands, the belly, and the face. And I'm going to do the same for the other keyframe. I'm using the onion skin to guide myself. If you want to, you could also copy the same keyframe and flip it horizontally. Okay, so now we have the keyframes with the details except for the antenna. Okay, the next step is the breakdown pose. The breakdown pose is how you transition between one keyframe to the next keyframe. So when keyframes are what story you're telling, the breakdown pose is how you tell that story. So I'm going to the middle of both keyframes in the timeline, frame 13, and I create a new one. You determine the personality of the animation in the breakdown pose. For instance, I could have a squashed transition, or maybe a stretched transition. But for now, I'm going ahead and add a regular transition, the most basic way in which we can go from one keyframe to the next. Now this animation goes from one side to the next and then comes back. So I'm going to copy this same keyframe in next second's half. So frame 37. And now we have from keyframe 2 breakdown, and then the animation starts again. And so it's a loop that goes from one side to the next and comes back. Okay, so now I'm going to in between this animation. I'm not going to add this antenna just yet because the antenna is going to follow the main body's motion. So it's going to be easier to draw it once we have all the in-betweens. Now for the in-betweens, we're going to do a slow in, slow out motion. This is one of the animation principles, and it means that actions usually start slow and end slow. So you can see this character is moving faster in the middle and slowing in the extremes. So we're going to do that. And just to visualize it better, I'm going to make an animation chart. So the in-betweens are the drawings that are in between other drawings. For instance, the in-between between this keyframe and the breakdown is this drawing. So we're going to draw this one first. And so the in-between of this in-between and this keyframe is this one. So that one goes second and then third. As you can see, to draw this in between, we need to have this one first. Not necessarily, but that's going to make things easier for us. And the same for the other side. We draw this one first, and then we use this one to draw the second one, and then we use the second one to draw the third one. Okay, so this chart represents spacing, and our timing is not going to follow that chart. But for now, I'm going to place myself in frame 7 and make my first in-between. And I'm going to follow my onion skin to know where to make the lines. If you're using a software where you need to add frames to a drawing, don't worry, we can always change the timing later. So let's go between the first two drawings and create a new one and make the next in-between. Okay, so we're missing another drawing here, but I'm going to change my timing first. I'm going to make every drawing last 3 frames. So if you're using a software where you have to add frames to the drawing, I believe Rough Animator works like this, make every drawing last 3 frames. So now I'm going to my last in-betweens from this side between the first and the second drawing. You can see the drawings are closer together. So now I have all the in-betweens from the first keyframe to the breakdown pose. You can see that each drawing lasts 3 frames. So the first one is on frame 1, the second one is on frame 4, the third one is on frame 7, the fourth one is on frame 10, and then the breakdown pose we already had. I could always move timing around. This is one of the advantages of digital animation. Okay, so now I'm going to do the other side. The next in-between goes in frame 16. And then I move 3 frames, frame 19, and the last in between, frame 22. So now we have the first second complete. And we only need to copy paste all these frames for the character to go back, and again every 3 frames. And now if we play the animation, we have the character complete. Okay, so now for the antenna, we're going to follow the body's motion. I'm going to make a new layer. We can always redraw later, so for now, I'm going to start in this position. And I'm going to go straight ahead for this, trying to capture how the physics of this antenna would work. I think maybe something like this. We can always change them later, so don't worry if you're not sure if this will work. Okay, so this frame is weird, but we can go back to it later. Okay, so I'm going to copy the first keyframe at the end of the animation to use it with the onion skin and then just delete it. Okay, let's see the playback. Okay, so now we can fix things. You can see that there is a kind of like a bounce, a jump somewhere here. So we can always go back and fix things. For example, this keyframe and this keyframe as well. Okay, I think this side is falling, so I'm going to try to make it more smooth. I'm just going back to frames that I notice are strange and fix them, redraw them. This one is weird. I think this is good enough. The main reason I made a new timeline for the antenna is that we can add more drawings maybe for the antenna without having to add more drawings to the main body. For example, in the first version I did, you can see that I added a new drawing here, and that's just the antenna having an extra frame because I felt it was necessary and it would look better. So let's see. But you know what? I kind of feel like I don't need an extra drawing. Okay, no, yeah, maybe in this transition. Okay, so I'm going to add a drawing between this frame and this other frame. It's actually different than my first animation. Okay, so I'm going to add one here. Unlike in my first version, I can make a mini smear. And you can see how that extra frame adds a nice detail. So one side and maybe here. So now this is the extra frame and you can see that the body doesn't move and the antenna does. Okay, so that's it for the rough animation. It's quite rough, but we're going to make a clean pass. However, if you want to post the rough animation, that's perfect. Okay, so for the clean pass, I'm going to reduce the opacity of the rough animation and make a new layer. Okay, so I used a brush that doesn't have pressure sensitivity. You can use the clean or inking style that you prefer. I just went with this one and I actually left holes in the line art. You can see that the line art is not completely closed. That is going to make coloring the animation a bit harder because you can't use the bucket tool and fill the drawing automatically. So you may want to not leave any gap, and that is going to make filling your drawing easier. By the way, you can make the floor in a separate layer so that you don't have to redraw it every time. And then I would just go to the next frame and clean the animation. If you only make one layer for the clean pass, you would have to copy and paste the body or maybe redraw it and then you can have a boiling line effect. You can see how this looks. Okay, now for the coloring. Again, we make another layer below the clean. Make sure your paint bucket tool can refer to other layers. And so we just fill in. And we just need to create new frames every time we paint. Okay, so in my first version, the characters have these blush details. And actually, I animated those in the color stage. Since it's a simple animation, you can go ahead and add extra details in the coloring stage. The clean and coloring stage are pretty self-explanatory. You just have to clean the lines you already animated and fill them with the colors of your choice. Okay, so that was it for the little guy's animation. If you prefer, you could animate only one of them. Okay, so now I'm going to animate the big guy. Again, we start with the keyframes and I'm going to roughly draw the floor and the egg-like shape. So now I'm going to do what I didn't do with the little guy, and it's copy and paste frames to save time and make things easier. Okay, so this animation has a bouncing movement up and down while the character is turning. The up and down drawings are the keyframes, since those are the extremes. So this is the up, and the next drawing is in frame 7. Again, the floor. And the down keyframe, which is the same shape but squashed. Squash and stretch is another of the 12 animation principles. Okay, so we have the bouncy movement. A round shape turning can be simulated with a cross. So we could use this same shape, as you can see, and use the cross to indicate the turn, which is what I'm going to do now. I'm going to copy and paste each frame for the first second, and we have the bouncy movement. And so this frame right here in the middle is the front position, and the first frame is turning left position. And so you can see that the cross indicates where the character is looking. And so we just need to in between that cross and squash it at the same time to simulate the turning. So it goes down and up while turning. And for the next frames, let me delete these ones, because I can actually reuse these 2 frames and flip horizontally. And you can see that I'm flipping the shapes, but they make sense, you know, the cross is following the movement. And now we have the bounce. I'm going to add the details here, and then I'm going to copy those drawings for the next second, because the animation, like the little guy's animation, is a boomerang. So the character goes one way and then returns. So I'm going to add details. Another useful thing to indicate that the character is turning is these lines. You can see that the arm that is behind has a line crossing over, and when it comes forward, we remove that line. Those T lines are useful to give a lot of information. So now the arm and the second. The belly also follows the cross orientation, and also the face. We can always move our keyframes around if we need to use other keyframe as reference. For example, I'm going to move this second drawing after the third drawing so that I can use the first drawing as reference to draw the third drawing. So you can see that I am following, kind of using as reference, and the floor, and now the arms and the face. And we can test how it turns out. And now I can return the second drawing to its place, and remember that it's squashing. We should be careful because the onion skin can confuse us, and we could draw the keyframe like a regular in between, and then it wouldn't respect the squash. I can use the cross as reference for the hands as well. So it's going down and it's almost at the same level. And remember that the cross was a good reference for the eyes. And I can also use the previous and next frame as reference. And now we have all the details. We're going to make the flower later. These frames, I had copied them and flipped them horizontally. So we could do that again and copy the details so that I don't have to draw them. So I'm going to delete those once again, and I'm going to Ctrl C, Ctrl V, and I'm going to flip the drawing and make sure that it falls right where it should. And the same with the first one, Ctrl C, Ctrl V, and then I flip it once more. And these are the keyframes. Okay, so now I'm going to copy the keyframes going back. So the approach we're having with this animation is going to be a bit different than the little guy's animation because, because it's different. First of all, you can see that the keyframes are 6 frames apart from each other. So if we want to continue with making the drawings last 3 frames, we only have space for one in between. So there is no breakdown, or we could say that the breakdown is like an in-between. And so I'm not going to add breakdowns or in-betweens just yet. This animation also does not have is in, is out. So it's already giving us enough information to draw the flower. And also, the little guy's antenna was following the body. The flower is also following the body. But since the movement has a faster rhythm, the flower doesn't have time to like move on its own pace like the antenna does. I don't know if I'm making sense. But once you animate it, you're going to understand it much better. I'm going to change to a blue color so that the flower is more noticeable. But I'm going to make like the circle, and I'm checking with the cross where I'm aligning it. Again, remember that we can move the drawings around to use other drawings as reference. I am using the stretched positions, and now I can squash just a little. Again, I can use the keyframe as reference and then return it to its place. Okay, so it was important to draw the circle first because that's where the petals are attached. Things like clothes or hair, or in this case the petals or the antenna, they follow the main movement. So when the character goes down, the petals are going to go up. You know, this is like physics stuff. And when the character goes up, the petals are going to go down. So this is our first drawing. And another thing is that I don't want to make the movement too exaggerated because then the flowers are going to move a lot. And this is a very quick movement. Now, this is something that you could do for your animation if you want. You could make like the petals go really down or really up. You can see that they don't go that far in my first version, but you could experiment with that. It could be interesting. Anyway, so the petals are going down and I don't want to exaggerate them that much. So I'm going to just, and the perspective here is kind of tricky. Okay, you can visualize a circle to help you with the perspective, like so. Another thing we need to consider is that the character is turning, so the flower is going to turn as well. Again, I'm going to move this keyframe to use the first one as a reference for the third one, and I drew this line to have a mark that I could identify and help me animate the turn. So that mark is just above the eye of the character. So it's going to be around here. And as you can see, that line is already turning, so it's really helping me. And again, it's going to be, I can also follow the circle. This next petal is almost here and then almost halfway through, and then this one is again halfway. Then I return this keyframe, and okay, so let me now make the drawing going down. I know that these two are my markers, so I'm just going to use them and mark here to help me with the turn. Okay, so now the flower is going up since the character is going down. Now this perspective may be tricky because the circle is now up, but also kind of like smaller because the petals are coming together. Okay, so the onion skin is very useful, but sometimes it can create a lot of noise and it can be confusing. So sometimes it's a good idea to turn it off and just good old flipping. And I think this is way too exaggerated, so I'm going to reduce it just a tiny bit. Okay, so now we have the 3 keyframes. Now I cannot do the same as copy and pasting for these last two keyframes because the petal is turning and it's not the same for the other side, so it's not flippable. But I am going to use the other squashed keyframe as reference like I have been doing. And the marker is here, so this is like halfway, kind of like an in-between, because the flower is turning, this petal is covering the ones behind. So you can see that it's not that this animation is harder than the other one, but the petals and their shape are harder to draw. This petal is weird, and that's when you realize that, you know, sometimes the onion skin is not useful. I'm adding this extra line because this is like behind the petal. This is also behind. You know, I can indicate with shade. Okay, so this one is like this, almost like a line, you know. So just remember that you can always redraw and fix things that look weird. And let me use that shading for this one as well, and this one. Okay, so now I'm going to use this frame for this one. Now let's review. I think it's going on well, and it comes back. Okay, so let's play the animation. And I think it looks all right. Now, in professional productions, before the clean stage, there usually is a tie-down stage in which the animator makes a cleaner pass of the animation. I mean, you could go all the way into the cleaning stage, but it may be frustrating to not know exactly where to place the line, and you don't want to be fixing your animation in the cleaning stage. So to make a tie down, just make another layer above, again, like if you were to clean the animation. And you can even use another color and maybe a less rough pencil and just tie down your animation. So as you can see, I am not cleaning it. I am just making the drawings less rough. Anyway, let's continue. So these were the keyframes. And as I said before, we don't have a breakdown, or our breakdown is the only in-between that we are going to have. So let's in-between this animation. So I am adding a drawing between these first two, and I'm going to use the onion skin. I'm going to start with the overall shape, the X shape, and this is a regular in between, so between the most stretched keyframe and the most squashed keyframe. And I could draw the cross, but I could also use the onion skin to know where to place my drawings. And this is kind of like a boiling line and the floor. Okay, so now I'm going to in between the flower, and I start with the circle. I should consider that the end of this petal and then the end of this petal are the extremes, and the in between would be around here. So now, it may look weird, but once it's moving, it makes sense. So if you look at this petal, it looks kind of weird, but it makes sense with the movement. So if a drawing is not convincing you, look at it with the animation and it may turn out to be fine. Okay, so now the other and the next. Okay, so we have the first in between. Next one. Next one. Next one. And there we have it. Rough animation done. Okay, so the cleaning for this character was the same as the little guy. So like I said, if you want to just fill in the colors, remember to close the lines, and you can clean and color these however you want. For example, I did clean the whatever is behind the petals, but I painted it, and so it looks like this. You could do so as well. And again, the blush, I made it in the coloring stage, so I animated it there just like I did with this guy. And what else? The shadows, so you can see, for example, here I painted in the coloring stage, I painted the shadow, so a bit more complicated. And finally, the shadows on the floor, I also animated them at the end with the colors. So a separate layer. As you can see, it's only 2 frames. So it's 1, 2, 1, 2, and that's just to add a subtle movement. I wouldn't make complicated shadows that maybe, for example, how this character is leaning to one side and then follow the shadow and animate it to the other side. You could do that if you want, but it's not necessary. And shadows in hand-drawn animation usually are more abstract. And so I have 1 frame here, and then every 3 frames I just redraw it for it to have a boiling line effect, and then I just repeat it and copy and paste it. It's a very simple detail, but it adds movement. One last recommendation would be to experiment with your colors and try which colors do you prefer, and change them and define them before the coloring stage. Because if you're already coloring and then you kind of want to change the colors or don't like what you chose, you would have to repaint everything, and it's best to decide the colors before that stage. And so that's it for the tutorial. The tutorial was mostly focusing on the rough animation, which is the difficult part. Hopefully you have fun making this animation, and please check out the challenge on Instagram and use the hashtag #tagme and have fun. I already said that, but yeah.